want to take a look at how some of the elements of World War II led to some cultural changes. The elements of the Holocaust and the atomic bomb radically shifted how we see ourselves within the modern world, and this happens periodically. There are some certain historical moments that create a radical shift in understanding who we are and why we're here. Right, one of those would have been way back during the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague that had a radical effect on how we see ourselves. Another one, a little bit more recently, would have been in the 18th century with the French Revolution. It changed the way that we understand ourselves, and it starts to impact art and culture as a result. And so we see the rise of Romanticism directly related to the French Revolution. And so there are historical moments that causes this shift, causes us to radically change the way we see ourselves, and art is going to then have to shift as well as a reflection of our world. And so World War II changed the way that we see ourselves. It changed our abilities of making sense of the world. Just a question, and kind of pick up where we left off last time. If art always reflects the world in which it was created, and chaos, confusion, disorder, violence, destruction, etc., dominate our world, what will art look like? Right. So again, something to think about. Right. What's art going to look like? Why is art, getting back to Stephen Hicks's article? Why is art so ugly in the modern world? It's because we've become ugly in the modern world, and they're trying to make sense of that. It's not as though artists are necessarily celebrating ugliness or brutality. They're reflecting that. They're creating awareness of it, right? Whereas if we're just sweeping all these elements underneath the rug and only focusing on the positive elements, then we're not really coming to a better understanding of ourselves. And we're not really coming to think about change. And so artists are trying to create awareness to create change. And so they're not necessarily trying to ignore the dark components of our society. They're casting a spotlight on it so that we can call attention to it, so we can call awareness to it, so we can't ignore it, right? And so some of the differences between what art and what propaganda seeks to do. And we've talked about Giacometti before and how his images look different because of the Holocaust, and they're radically changed. But we see a different representation of the human condition between this National Socialist art or the Nazi art here on the right versus what's happening elsewhere, of trying to make sense of the modern world, about the brutality, the ugliness of it, and trying to work through it. Not just saying that this is ugly, so let's celebrate ugliness. It's saying this is ugly, so what can we do, or how can we live within the trauma or anxiety or violence and brutality that we live in. So art is going to look greatly different than the prettiness of what we expect art to be. We've taken a look at Dadaism. I just want to do a brief review because it was several weeks ago. Mainly, Dadaism is a response to World War I, as a way to protest political, social, and religious institutions that just say, hey, go fight for God and country, right? So this idea of nationalism, go fight and die by the millions, all for the sake of, your country, or all for the sake of God or whatever. And it all came to naught, right? It was all for, essentially for nothing, and nothing really came of it, and there's no major advances, and it all seemed meaningless. And so art started to reflect the meaninglessness of the world that they lived in. And we see elements of this where we see the murdering plane, where we see the human body that's turned into a mechanism in order to kill and to maim and to harm people. Or we see with Duchamp's The Fountain, the absurdity of the world that we live in that seems to make no sense. If art's going to reflect that absurdity, then what you need to do is you need to find something equally absurd to reflect that experience. And so we see that with Duchamp. Here's another one that he does. I don't think we talked about this one before, in Advance of a Broken Arm, where he just goes into a hardware store and buys a shovel. He doesn't make it, right? So again, this is his ready-made, something that he just goes in and buys, and now it becomes art. And so then he starts to question, what does art even mean in a meaningless world? Or what can art mean in a meaningless world? Or in this one, he's questioning this idea of beauty, right? We generally tend to think of the Mona Lisa as the pinnacle of Western art and Western beauty. And he defiles it by, giving her a goatee and a mustache and saying she has a hot backside that's the title LHOOQ on the bottom. to get us to question what is beauty, right? Is not the world that we're living in a little bit grotesque? And so he's and absurd, and so he's calling attention to this. Or this one he calls an assisted ready-made as well. So he calls this one an assisted ready-made because he assists it with a mustache and goatee. This one's assisted ready-made because he takes two objects that are already made and just puts them together. But putting them together changes the context of both of them and makes them both lose their function and gives them both new meaning. But it's not as though he's describing, I understand everything, this is the way the world is. He's suggesting that I don't have all the answers, and so turning to art as a way to make sense of the absurdity of the world is absurd too. And so, in some ways, I know it sounds like he's kind of pushing an agenda here about the world is absurd, and so he's reflecting that absurdity, and that is an agenda to have. But he's also suggesting by the same time, I don't have all the answers to what feels to be absurd. Or this one, just again, is similar to what we see as an assisted ready-made. This one's by Man Ray. Takes an iron and puts spikes on it, so it changes the context of it, takes the functionality of something and makes it different. Surrealism. I want to talk a little bit about surrealism. We've kind of touched upon it a little bit before when we talked about modern religious art, because we saw a couple images by Salvador Dali, who's the main surrealist. But surrealism was an outgrowth of Dadaism, right? And it began in the 1920s as an outgrowth of Dadaism's critique on rational order, the ability for the human mind to make sense of the world through reason, through senses, through intellect, right? Taking two moments, for instance, like historical moments, and piecing together and saying, oh, this is why, right? This is the cause and effect relationship with that. And they're suggesting, well, if the world is meaningless and life seems meaningless, then trying to find order and meaning is meaningless too. And so they're questioning all rational order, science and social sciences, anything that's trying to make sense of the world. Surrealism, however, does something quite different than Dadaism. So it was strongly influenced by Freud's structural model, believing that underneath the human subconscious lie very strong sexual and violent desires that humans must repress. And so the idea is that there are these desires that drive us and to behave in certain ways, right? Violent or aggressive ways. And we're not necessarily always aware of them. And so they're suggesting that they want to understand what's motivating humanity to things like World War I, or later that we're going to see World War II, because surrealism is a little bit before World War II. But they believe that the best way to understand humankind is through understanding our subconscious. Hence, much of their works are dominated by dreamlike sequences with themes of sexuality, violence, fear of death, and the uncanny. And so they're more interested, they're suggesting if you really want to understand human beings, you have to take off the mask that we put on as we go out and into the world and understand what's below the surface. And so they're trying to get below the surface. Just to give you a sense of what the uncanny is, the uncanny is something that looks familiar to us and foreign at the same time, that produces a sense of anxiety, right? So this one, I think it was called Button Eyes. I don't know. I couldn't watch it. It was too freaky. But anyway, it's that idea of the button eyes where we can recognize something that looks familiar, but also the creepy button eyes just makes it a little bit off-putting. Or Polar Express, this was kind of a flop at the box office because the children were creeped out that the figures looked too realistic, but yet not quite realistic enough. So they weren't cartoonish enough for the children to identify with them, and so it was too uncanny. It was too weird, right? So that is what the uncanny is, and that's what we see within surrealism. Is they're trying to depict things that look kind of real to us and kind of foreign at the same time, and so things that look kind of familiar to us in the persistence of memory, or it's also known as the melting clocks, and you can see kind of the melting clocks here, are the clocks, right? We recognize the clocks and we say, hey, that kind of looks like a clock, but he changes the context of that and makes them look melting, right? So it gives it kind of this dreamlike, weird kind of vibe to it. Again, trying to understand what are the anxieties underneath the surface. And so Salvador Dali here is painting his dreams to understand what's going on beneath the surface of the human condition. And what we see here, again, just some of the uncanny. We see a tree here and what appears to be like a table or something. So putting them in context, right? That's either a really tiny, tiny tree or it's a ginormous table or whatever the case may be. And then down here we see something that looks kind of familiar to us. This could be, I don't know, a duck's head, right? With a bill right here. or it could be someone's nose. This could be an eyelash, right? So it's elements that look kind of familiar to us, but kind of different. And so it produces an anxiety, and this is getting us to understand what are the anxieties beneath the human condition. And generally, what we see within Dali as well is going to be something like fear of death or decay. And we're going to see a lot of ants. We see some ants here, some flies here. These generally represent the fear of death, that in the back of our minds, we're constantly concerned. We're aware of that. We have a finite amount of time on this earth, and so that's also driving human behavior. Here we see the metamorphosis of Narcissus. Narcissus is an old myth where he falls in love with it. He sees himself reflecting in a pool of water, and he falls in love with himself. A couple of different accounts. Some say that he couldn't stop looking at himself, and so he just kind of withered away and starved to death because he couldn't eat. He just constantly looked at himself. Another one suggests that he fell in and drowned. It just depends on myths. Always depend on who's telling the story. The gods took mercy on him and then kind of resurrected him as a flower. And so we see something somewhat familiar, kind of like a head here and some hair here, and maybe some shoulders and a knee here. But it also looks kind of like a rock or kind of some type of structure here. We recognize some fingers, but again, this looks a little more sculptural. Looks kind of more like some type of rock out in nature too. So it has that kind of blending. And then we recognize the flower, but we don't see flowers emerging from eggs. And so just kind of dreamlike sequences. A lot of students that I have, they struggle with Taoism. They don't like the absurdity, and they get frustrated with it. And maybe in part they miss that it's supposed to be humorous. But a lot of people like surrealism, right? They like the fact that it's kind of blending that idea of reality and unreal within their works. Here's Magritte, another surrealist, and he calls this one the false mirror. And he just gives us a couple of things that just to focus on. The extreme close-up, right? So we're just really close to the eye, which already kind of sets us kind of at unease because we're not used to seeing people this close, right? We're not used to standing that close. And I'm definitely during during this time of the coronavirus. But it's already kind of getting us to kind of inviting us into this intimate space. And then we recognize that there's an eye here, but then again, the uncanny, something familiar and foreign to us, we see the clouds that are reflected within the eye. And so that's a little bit different. And then he titles this the false mirror. And so similar to Dadaism, their critique on rational order, that if we're going to use our eyes to make sense of the world, our rational thought, it's going to be false. It's going to lead us to false conclusions. And so we can't trust the exterior world. We can't trust the rational world. We can only turn within, right? The inner mind is what really is within truth, right? That's how we get truth. Ce n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe, right? That's like the subtitle, but it's called The Treachery of Images. And here's another Magritte image, and he gives us a painting of a pipe. And then he writes in French, "This is not a pipe." And it gives us this kind of tension. Again, that kind of familiar and foreign. We recognize the pipe, but we don't recognize the words in connection with a pipe. And so he's questioning our ability to find meaning. Is this really a pipe? What is truth? What is reality? Is something that the surrealists are heavily concerned with. I wanted to just leave off with abstract expressionism, to think about, surrealism and abstract expressionism as we think about, World War II, leading up to World War II, in the interwar period, is mainly surrealism is kind of the dominant movement. And then what happens after the war is going to be abstract expressionism. And abstract expressionism is going to be kind of an outgrowth of surrealism. It's going to look different, it's going to feel different, but it also has some elements of surrealism. And here's kind of my definition of abstract expressionism. It has roots that date back to before World War II with Kandinsky's and Picasso's abstract works. These artists asserted that beauty in art should no longer be about mirroring the exterior world. It's about demonstrating insights that artists have about the world. Right? So it's not about representing reality, it's about the insight of the artist. We talked about that before. Surrealists also influenced abstract expressionism with its focus on representing inner thoughts. Pollock asserts that art is about the inner world. Unlike surrealists, though, Abstract expressionist art is entirely void of visual reality because the inner world of emotions has no exterior reference. Furthermore, they build upon the ideas of Carl Jung by promoting the idea that within the individual psyche lays universal truths or a collective unconscious. And so, what abstract expressionists are seeking to do is if we go within the mind and unlock truths of the inner mind, then maybe we can find something that everyone can benefit from, some truths that are common to everyone. And so they're mainly concerned that the world is heading in the wrong direction in the aftermath of the Holocaust and nuclear bombs. They're trying to say, okay, humanity needs to, we need a mulligan. We need to start fresh. We need to change drastically the course because we're leading to our own destruction. And so they see art as a way for us to really reflect on what is driving us. What do we really want to be? And so they're trying to find unconscious truths that we can all share. Hence, their art is a process to discover truth that is common to everyone. Most works are not about the final product per se, but they are more about the fact of arriving at the final product in what art critic Harold Rosenberg calls action painting. So here's, Jackson Pollock, and some of you, I think probably most of you are familiar to some extent with his works, and most people would say, well, this is just kind of scribbles on a canvas, but it might be much more than that, and it's hard to convey the depth and complexity of a Pollock when you're just taking a look at a digital image, and it's definitely difficult when we're doing this remotely online. But I want to take a look at some of the ideas that he's representing. He's heavily influenced by Native American sand painting. And the idea of Native American sand painting, the Navajo specifically, sand painting, is that you drop sand over over an area, like a surface, and you just create, right? And so we're not going to watch all of this, obviously. I mean, if you're enthralled, you can watch more of this on YouTube. But the idea of creating an image through dropping it and through exploration, right? And so he's trying to find a new way to represent the human experience because he finds himself, in the aftermath of World War II, in a very different way. And so he's suggesting that we can't just go back to the traditional forms of art to represent where we're at because we're in a completely different. There's a clear break in the aftermath of World War II. So we need to find new ways. We need to find new methods. And so he goes to Native Americans, which is generally, right, stereotypically perceived to be more kind of pure, pre-civilization, the human corruptions of rational thought and whatnot. This is more true to the basic elements, kind of getting back to, I mean, how some see as the Garden of Eden, right? The true nature of human innocence. I guess that's some of the mindset of what the narrative, what some believe at the time. But what we see is trying to find a different technique, a different artistic technique that's going to direct humanity in this new age that they find themselves in. And the element that he borrows from this is the idea of putting the canvas on the floor, right? So this idea of drip technique, and we'll see him talk about this. And I have a couple ideas that I want you to get out of this on the right hand side. But this is him in the process of creating art, talking about his art.
More at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting, similar to the Indian fan fingers of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping, fluid paint. I also use sand, broken glass, pebbles, string, nails, or other foreign matter. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. The technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting. But I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
So for him, it's not necessarily about conveying a story, right? That's kind of the traditional way of of art, and even with Picasso's Guernica, he's telling the story of the bombing of Guernica. What we see with Jackson Pollock's art is it's vastly different. This is not necessarily about telling a story of a particular moment. It's about an investigation. It's about trying to understand the self and trying to go deep within. And the argument here is that we feel before we think. As human beings, we don't come out, speaking full sentences. We just come out feeling hungry. We feel tired, right? We feel happy. We feel sad. Whatever the case may be, we feel. And then we're taught to have rational thought and to think and to communicate. And so he's suggesting that human thought can be I don't know, impure or corrupted or to some extent. And so he's trying to get back to the pure essence of what humanity is, right? So the idea of feeling and not, being influenced by ideology and propaganda and these things that we've been talking about, but to get back to the true essence and if we can find that true essence, maybe we can change course and not lead towards our, destruction. And I like this quote by Willem de Kooning is another abstract expressionist. He's a contemporary to Jackson Pollock, and they both knew each other in the inner circles of the New York art scene. But here's what he says. Every so often, a painter has to destroy painting. Cezanne did it. Picasso did it with Cubism. Then Pollock did it, right? And so what he's doing is going to be something that's radically different than what's been done before. And I think it's easy to take a look at this, just kind of scribbles on a canvas and just say, kind of dismissively, it's just, he's a fake, he's a fraud. This is, any child can do this. But when you stand in front of it, it has a different kind of context. This is a photo taken by another a colleague of mine in the humanities department. He was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City one day and sitting in front of Autumn Rhythm, this work that I've been showing you, and just kind of taking it in. There's just kind of a seat right in front of it, and he was just kind of taking it in. And then there's a girl that comes by. She's about your guys' age, in her early 20s, early mid 20s, and she probably was forced to go to an art museum because she's taken a humanities class or something, and she had her earbuds in, kind of looking at the floor, probably not enjoying the fact that she was forced to go to an art museum or whatever the case may be. And she walks by this kind of with her head kind of towards the ground. She's kind of looking at her feet instead of the art around her. And then as she kind of walks past this, it catches kind of something catches out of the corner of her eye. And then she stops and she takes a few steps back. And then she goes all the way back to the right and then slowly starts walking to the left. And so something, I think what, my colleague captured here is something's happening within her. As Jackson Pollock is investigating, himself and just reflecting his feelings and his thoughts and the chaos that he finds himself in, there's something that reached out to her, right? That spoke something as she's now invited to investigate and to study and to think about her reactions, right? But again, a lot of people take a look at this and they just say it's chaos and confusion. And in some ways, yes, it is chaos and confusion. And that's pretty much the world that we live in today, right? There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of confusion out there. So this is a reflection of the world that we live in. But in another way, there's some beauty to this. It's the beauty to search through the chaos and confusion, the beauty to take it head on, to grapple with it rather than to try to ignore it, to sweep it under the rug, and to pretend that it's not there, right? But it's a journey, it's an investigation to try to move past it. And so here's a quote by Jackson Pollock as you think about this particular work here called The Mural. Again, there's nothing discernible, there's no depth or objects that are being represented because it's mainly about the artist trying to convey his own thoughts. And Jackson Pollock, as he was influenced by Navajo sand painting and trying to find different methods. Another element that he's strongly influenced by is jazz and the improvisational elements of jazz, right? So he thinks that art should be something about improvisation, what you're feeling at the time, and working through that to understand what you're feeling at the time. And here's what he says: it seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or of any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique. The modern artist, it seems to me, is working and expressing an inner world. In other words, expressing the energy, the motion, and other inner forces. And so, what he's suggesting here is we can't reflect the world around us in the way of past artists. We have to look for something different, right? Here's another one, Jackson Pollock's number 5. At the time when this was sold in 2006, which is almost 15 years ago, this was the highest work of art ever sold. It was sold for $140 million, and I think some of us can take a look at that and say, "Wow, the art world is pretty stupid," or people who buy art or just have a lot of money to waste, and there probably is some truth to that to some extent, but there's something here, and what I would encourage you to do before you just completely dismiss Jackson Pollock is to go and seek one out and stand in front of it, right? And to think about the thoughts of that I've been telling you, right? Giving you the context of how to read and how to interpret where he's coming from, to experience it differently, and then come back to me and tell me, before you just immediately dismiss it and say this is a fraud and this is stupid. Actually experience it, because that's what abstract expressionist art is meant to do. It's meant to be experienced. I want to take a look at another couple of artists, just to give you a sense of that not all of them are doing exactly what Jackson Pollock is doing. Mark Rothko mainly focuses on colors and simple shapes, but the idea is to take the chaos and confusion of the day that we live in and to simplify it, because maybe we're too chaotic, and so he's trying to simplify it to a certain extent. And here's a couple of quotes to get you to think about what he says and how he's seen art. He says, "A painting is not a picture of an experience, but is the experience." And so that's different from past art, which is mainly just trying to represent, whether it's Guernica or whether it's, Rembrandt's Bathsheba or whatever the case may be. It's about telling, about a story that's being told. He's suggesting that art should not be about telling a story. It's the experience. That's art. So part of art is about you going and interacting with it, right? He says, "You've got sadness in you, I've got sadness in me, and my works of art are places where the two sadnesses can meet. And therefore, both of us need to feel less sad." Right? So the idea of trying to come together and to connect through art and to be united and I can understand how some people could stand in front of this and they're expecting art to tell them something, or to be visual and to be easy to understand. And when they see this, they say, "I don't get it." What it could be is they're thinking too much about it and they're not feeling enough about it, right? Just kind of thinking about, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings that you're feeling? And not just, "Oh, this is stupid," but just to kind of think about what's happening to me. What's the experience, right? He says, "I'm not an abstractionist. I'm not interested in relationships of color or form or anything else. I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions: tragedy, ecstasy, doom. And if you are moved only by their color relationships, then you've missed the point," right? So it's about these larger themes of human emotions. A couple more Rothko's, just to give you a sense of some similarities, just so you can kind of recognize them and know what's going on within them. He says, "The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them." And so he sees art as this experience, as a spiritual experience. And a lot of abstract artists, abstract expressionists, believe that the world has lost its spirituality. We've become too rational, too mechanical, too attached to our devices or our electronics, or too attached to science, that we become cold and unfeeling. And that's what's leading to things like genocide. But if we can find spirituality once again, if we can find the ability to connect and to have emotions, then maybe we can avoid these catastrophes. He says, "I want to eliminate all obstacles between the painter and the idea, and between the idea and the observer, by removing such things as history, memory, geometry, the logic, the rationality." He wants to remove that and just focus on feeling, spirituality, right? He says, for a while, the authority of the doctor or plumber is never questioned. So you can kind of think about this quote to all those that want to criticize Rothko or abstract expressionists in general. For a while, the authority of the doctor and plumber is never questioned. Everyone deems himself a good judge and an adequate arbiter of what a work of art should be and how it should be done, right? So everyone thinks that they know what art is when they're probably, and some might and some might not. And so just some thoughts to consider. And I'll leave you off with Barnett Newman and his Vir Hirca Sublimus, the man, the hero, and the sublime is what that translates to. And what we see here is he's trying to recreate the sublime. Newman was another abstract expressionist that was heavily concerned that we've lost our spirituality, we've lost our way, and so he's trying to recreate that. And the sublime, what the sublime is this high state of emotional ecstasy, right? This high point of this spirituality where we can be overcome and we can feel uplifted and edified, right? I think in the church, I mean, he wouldn't use this. He uses the term sublime. Maybe I'm kind of applying too much of our doctrine or theology to this, but in some ways, it sounds like he's trying to recreate what the Spirit would be, right? Something we've lost the ability to feel the Spirit, to be guided by spirituality within the world, and so he's trying to create an experience for people to be able to feel that once again. Because in the day and age of today, we're no longer feeling. We just kind of go from kind of mindlessly from one thing to another thing, and we're not really connecting anymore. And maybe COVID-19 has given us a kind of a reappreciation for that. But we're disconnected. In a world of more connectivity, we've never been more disconnected. So he's trying to find through art a way for us to reconnect. He says, I hope that my painting has the impact of giving someone, as it did me, the feeling of his own totality, of his own separateness, and his own individuality, right? This idea of trying to understand who we are. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Any art worthy of its name should address life, man, nature, death, and tragedy. So these big themes of life, of the human condition is what they're seeking to do. And it's, at first you can kind of say, well, it's just kind of red spots, kind of red on a canvas with some white spot or some white strips here. But it's so much more. It's about being immersed in it. It's about just kind of connecting with the art. And just to close here, it's kind of interesting. The government has had an interesting relationship with abstract expressionism. By and large, a lot of people struggle with abstract expressionism because they want that, the bowl of fruit or whatever the case may be. They want something visual. And for the most part, most government officials thought the same. But they wanted to use abstract expressionism at the same time. And so the CIA funded several art exhibits in Europe for abstract expressionists, for American artists to go exhibit their work in Europe. And you think about, well, why in the world would the government fund artists that they don't like and they don't understand to go to Europe to fund art? And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Right, during the 1950s, there were several exhibits, and here's what Truman said. President Truman said, "If that's art, then I'm a Hottentot." Right, so he's suggesting that this is not art because he has that kind of traditional aspect of what art should be. But I wanted to read through this quote by a former CIA operative, and this quote is written in kind of the English. So you're going to see some different spellings. And so when it says SIC, that's the spelling in citation. And so this is the way it's spelled in England, right? It was recognized that abstract expressionism was the kind of art that made social realism look even more stylized and more rigid and confined than it was. And that relationship was exploited in some of the exhibitions. In a way, our understanding was helped because Moscow in those days was very vicious in its enunciation of any kind of nonconformity to its own very rigid patterns. And anyone and so one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth support one way or another, right? And so the idea of this is that America was, the propaganda is the land of the free, right? Whereas Russia was the land of the locked up, culturally speaking. And so this provided a clear juxtaposition between what was going on with Stalin's art. And so they said, if this is Stalin's art, we're going to juxtapose this to show how free, how culturally diverse we are in the United States. And so that's why abstract expressionism became kind of one of the tools in which the government used to promote, to combat communism, to combat the Soviet Union. And so kind of an interesting relationship. I mean, and so then we have to think about, is that propaganda then, right? So this is originally art created by an artist, individual expression, right? All of those things that we talked about within when we talked about art. Is it new? Does it have gravitas? Does it have emotion? Is it timely and timeless, right? So all of those ideas. But now they're taking that idea, the government's taking that idea and now promoting an agenda to it. And so then again, that it becomes quite tricky, right? When does this, its artistic components start to wane and its propagandistic elements start to arise? And so again, that's a discussion that we can continue to have.